Well, welcome viewers. Dr. JWA, theologist since 1994. Who is ruling Australia? A behavioural political analysis. I would hope that it's more of a therapy journey for people who have felt internally abused, mentally abused, trying to make sense out of the chaos coming from the establishment. This is episode 40, when Australians started realising power no longer believed itself accountable above the system. In episode 39, I examined establishments progressively losing fear of constitutional and divine limits, originally restraining institutional power internally. And this episode escalates the exposure further. Would you believe that? Yeah, unfortunately it's going to. Authority increasingly behaving as though the system itself has become the highest moral reference point within Australian life. And viewers, at first the transition still appeared administrative. More procedural authority, more institutional reinterpretation, more behavioural governance replacing inherited constitutional restraint beneath expanding managerial structures. And Australians continued assuming the establishment still recognised boundaries beyond institutional preference itself. Then slowly another recognition began surfacing beneath the constitutional fatigue. Power no longer merely exercised authority. It increasingly defined morality through authority. Tickle versus giggle. Look it up. I'll say that again. Very short sentence, very powerful, healing words. The establishment increasingly defined morality through authority. In other words, follow or be punished. And that distinction changes the entire atmosphere underneath society. Because Australia's Christian constitutional inheritance originally assumed morality preceded government, truth preceded administration, conscience preceded institutional permission, and divine sovereign authority ultimately judged both ruler and citizen alike. The government, viewers, just let me remind you and the government did not create moral reality. It existed beneath it. But once establishments sever themselves from divine restraint, institutions progressively begin repositioning themselves as interpreters of morality, regulators of acceptable conscience, definers of permissible truth, and administrators of behavioural legitimacy itself. And that inversion becomes existentially dangerous, as we are seeing. Because power detached from higher authority eventually stops asking, what are we forbidden from becoming? And begins asking instead, what can be justified administratively? And I've got some bad news. The paradox deepens further. Institutions continue speaking about rights, democracy, fairness, inclusion, I'll say it again, inclusion, and public trust, while simultaneously expanding interpretive authority, behavioural supervision, emotional management, procedural dependency, and constitutional flexibility beneath institutional continuity. And I think I should say we have to look at this only from the corrupted side. There are moral structures within our societies that work. What we're focusing on is at the top, where it's all gotten lost because they've got no boundaries to help them stay stable, morally stable. And the establishment increasingly behaves as though constitutional limits exist primarily for citizens, while institutions themselves retain evolving interpretive exemption through administrative necessity. And that is where constitutional order destabilises psychologically, because citizens begin sensing power no longer fears moral exposure. Administration no longer fears divine accountability. And institutions no longer meaningfully believe themselves restrained by Christian constitutional assumptions inherited from earlier Australia. And this is why constitutional forgetting matters so profoundly, not merely historically, behaviourally. You see, a population disconnected from divine sovereign authority, Christian moral formation, constitutional memory, and divine restraint gradually loses the psychological framework required to recognise when institutional authority itself becomes spiritually disordered beneath procedural normality. I should have put procedural misaligned normality. And that disorder rarely appears dramatic initially. It appears efficient, reasonable, managerial, protective, compassionate, and necessary, until eventually the system itself becomes the highest practical moral reference point within public life and within itself. And that is the establishment replacement occurring underneath modern Australia. Not merely political expansion, civilizational enthronement of administratively self-referential authority. And somewhere beneath the procedural continuity, another truth slowly begins surfacing. And I ask you to listen very carefully to my closing statement. Once institutions stop recognising divine sovereign authority above themselves, constitutional limits gradually weaken into negotiable administrative concepts rather than binding moral restraints. Power remains permanently forbidden to cross. Now I'm going to read that again because I got a little bit lost myself there. Once institutions stop recognising divine sovereign authority above themselves, constitutional limits gradually weaken, there are protections, into negotiable administrative concepts rather than binding moral restraints. Power remains permanently forbidden to cross. See, the power should be permanently forbidden to cross those moral restraints, but it is. Like, subscribe, comment to educate me, and share to help somebody else. I'm Dr. J.W. Ayub, theologist since 1994. I'll see you in the next talk if you're interested, entitled When Australians Started Realising the System Had Positioned Itself as the Highest Authority.